By great coincidence, it was the missionary devotion of the Moravians that first brought this particular form of pietism its place in the development of the thought and religious leadership of John Wesley. Wesley's boyhood was spent in the parsonage of a very high church Anglican clergyman. His father, Samuel Wesley, was committed to an Arminian rather than an extreme Calvinist interpretation of the 39 Articles. At the same time, he was deeply committed to the regularity of celebration of sacraments and the discipline of his parish. Samuel Wesley was overwhelmed at home by his extremely forceful wife, Susanna, who was by all odds the most powerful force in the regimented household in which young John and his sisters and brothers grew up. John became an undergraduate at Oxford in Christ Church, the college whose chapel was Oxford Cathedral and whose founder had been Cardinal Wolsey. Many nobility and royals had attended this school. Wesley's life was as carefree as anything that Wesley could ever do, but seriously debt-ridden. Having received his B.A. and being ordained, he reports in 1725 being exceedingly affected, having read Jeremy Taylor's Exercises of Holy Living and Dying. He became more serious after this, and in 1726 was elected a Fellow of Lincoln, a small but profound and scholarly Oxford college that was founded to combat the followers of Wycliffe at the university. On several times he had to leave school to assist his father as curate at Epworth and Root. But he did return to school in 1729, and he found that his younger brother Charles and a group of his friends, among them one George Whitefield, had formed a voluntary association for self-discipline, for the management of time and of life toward the maximum service to God and to other humans. They were seeking, even as undergraduates, for a community to which Wesley's name became inextricably attached later. This is the striving for the perfect Christian communion or Christian perfection. Now, less strenuous companions were referred to as the Holy Club, and sometimes they were even referred to with excoriation as Methodists. John was a member of the group and eventually its leader. They suffered a good deal of ridicule and abuse. In 1735, Benjamin England, John, and Charles Wesley were appointed by the governor of Oglethorpe to establish the new colony of Georgia, where John was supposed to be some sort of supervisor of religious instruction, and to found churches within the colony, and to perform missionary services to the neighboring Indians. He hoped to bring Christianity not only to the Indians, but also through that act to perfect his own personal religion. All did not go well on his voyage across. Having been an Oxford don and having read much travel literature, he had a highly romanticized idea of what travel was and what the sea was. During a violent storm, not unexpectedly, John became violently seasick. Others on board did not. Apparently, some among them were emigrants who sang hymns in a way that only Wesley could conclude. The lack of seasickness was somehow attached to the lack, to the conviction expressed in the hymns. So he thought that if he were more like the Moravians in his religious commitments, he too would not suffer seasickness. Arriving in Georgia, Wesley set to work teaching Christianity to the colonists and to the Indians. Once again, he had a naive picture, but a standard one in the travel literature of indigent peoples as simple, lovable children of nature, noble in all respects. And he was astonished when he discovered that the effects of colonization had transformed these indigenous peoples into persons of alcohol dependency and social disapprobation. Wesley's period of religious service in Georgia ended in catastrophic failure, and he had to return home. Back in England, he sought other Moravian missionaries with whom to speak, and one among them, Peter Bowler, attempted to counsel him, but it appears that Wesley widely misunderstood what Bowler was perhaps intending, and so Wesley concluded from what Bowler said that because he did not have profound emotional and religious experience, he was still an unbeliever. So Wesley was intent upon having a profound experience to underscore his status as a believer. In 1738, Wesley apparently, or is alleged to have gone to a mission on Aldersgate Street, and the apocryphal story, now widely doubted, is that he heard a reading of Luther's exposition of Romans, and quite fortuitously had the sort of profound emotional response for which he was looking. At this point, he claimed that his heart had been strangely warmed. This is a view that his wife probably would have contested, as she frequently had to rap him over the head with a cast iron frying pan to get his attention. However much the rhetoric of feeling appeared in Wesley, it did not supplant his basic commitment to the practice of Christian life. Indeed, having felt some enthusiasm, he visited Herrnhut and was deeply disillusioned by the experience. He saw there too much antinomianism and what seemed to him to be spiritual complacency in the stronghold of Moravian piety. So he returned with a sense of relief to the more prosaic disciplines of his English associates. He began to read devotional works, including Taylor's Holy Living and Dying, Thomas à Kempis's The Imitation of Christ, and William Law's Early Christian Perfection and Serious Call. He even took up some of the work of Jakob Böhme, in which he sought to understand more deeply the life of the mystic. Nonetheless, the preference remained closer to the work of Tauler and his more moderate form of mystical writing. It is possible, even though Wesley was not a systematic theologian, but rather an occasional theologian, it is possible to develop a basic picture of his theological perception in which it becomes clear that, far from the widespread conviction that the Reformation joined a work ethic with piety, that it was in fact Wesley and his followers who most nearly joined a work ethic with piety. The ground on which it seemed to Wesley that theology must rest is first, last, and always the Bible. If we're to understand the Bible, it is most successfully read through the guidance of early Christian patristic writings. It seemed to him that to prefer the apostolic fathers, and more generally the ante-Nicene writers, to later Christian interpreters of the Bible is only to give proper honor to those who stood nearest to the original revelation. This was not a view that was singularly original with Wesley. In the Anglican tradition, great stress was already being laid upon the recovery of knowledge of the thought of the ante-Nicene Church. Besides these two documentary sources, he found secondary value also in the findings of reason with respect to so much of the being of God and of God's will as may be discovered in the world of nature. He was, in fact, a voracious, if not a systematic and technically trained student of the literature of the natural sciences. Works on physics, biology, and medicine were on his list of books read in 1728. He had taken a special interest in biology and went to the trouble of translating selections from a biological treatise by a Swiss biologist, Bonnet of Geneva. Bonnet traced the linkages of various species of plant and animal life into a systematic hierarchy, and this he did with considerable detail. To Wesley, as it had to Calvin before him, this seemed to be one of the ways in which the glory of God was made manifest. The frank acceptance of disciplined reason working on the basis of observation always balanced and corrected his appreciation of the movement of feeling in religious life. Indeed, he tended to be suspicious of emotion, even after he ceded that it had some role, perhaps even importance. He absolutely opposed the development within the Wesleyan community of what came to be called enthusiasm. It made him nervous to see this more violent kind of religious response because he thought it to be dangerous and antithetical to the balances of society, and for that reason could not be welcomed as normative for Christian life. He might be willing to recognize that it had its place, but for himself he was adamant that it was not the right way. Wesley's conception of God diverges little from the middle road traditional view, Arminian rather than stringently Calvinistic. God is the creator and governor of the universe. He's not one whose government consists in rigorous foreordination or determination. And he is not one who is so remote from the world that the linkage of natural law stands between humans and God's presence. On the contrary, God is performing miracles throughout the course of human history, and even now. Wesley rejects over against all the deists and the strict Calvinists the judgment either that God never has performed miracles or that miracles are all in the past. In essence, Wesley rejected the Westminster Confession. Instead, Wesley insisted that God is performing miracles now. God is not to be regarded as bound by the laws of nature, which are part of the creation, and God is not to be regarded as one who has ruthlessly determined every event that comes to pass. Precisely because God is just, God cannot have foreordained all that transpires. With respect to Wesley's interpretation of the nature of humans and the present plight of humans, we can readily describe this with reference to the conception of the character of living things that was widespread in the 18th century. This is a conception which has come to be known as, quote, the great chain of being, end quote. This conception refers to a picture of the universe that is so ordered that there is a gradual progression in complexity from the simplest to the more and the still more complex beings. Among plants and animals in particular, there is an unbroken succession of types. Hence there are no gaps in the chain anywhere. There are no missing links, but rather each form of life is flanked on both sides by forms so closely related to it that one can pass, in theory, from any part of the scale to any other part without a break. Wesley appropriated this conception and translated it from the work of Bonnet. He singles out passages which call attention to the unbrokenness of this progression. He's particularly interested in certain forms of marine life that are intermediates between plants and animals. For example, the ostrich is in some sense a link between birds and reptiles on the one hand and mammals on the other. The ostrich runs like a horse with big hoofs instead of flying, and the apes are a kind of preliminary sketch for humans. They are so close to humans in structure and behavior that one may say here is a clear indication of the way in which God has meant to place humans on the scale of being so that humans will have a very near neighbor below them, just as presumably they have near neighbors in the angels above them. In the great chain of being, humans occupy the crucial position. For humans alone among terrestrial beings can all be said to have been made according to the image of God. Now, we should not think of this as an evolutionary theory. The thought is not that there are first only simpler forms and then gradual changes they become more complex, but they are created side by side in such fashion that they form a graduated series. Nor is there any case or suggestion here that there is some kind of adversity to which some species succumb and others adapt and therefore survive. This is an earlier view which still was working on the ancient view of Textus, the interweaving of God's purposes and of the movement of life. In any event, Wesley claims that humans alone are created according to the image of God, and this has in Wesley's mind, natural, political, and moral implications. The natural image of God in humans is to be found in the human status as spirit, with the power of self-initiating movement and self-direction, and the capacity of human intelligence, which not, wrote Wesley, if not the essence, seems to be the most essential property of a spirit. Let me point out again that it was intelligence that Wesley cited as the most essential property of spirit, not feeling. Once again, is the human capacity for free choice, without which will and understanding would be utterly useless. And it is in the political image of God that humans' dominion over other living beings on earth is to be understood. At first created, humans' understanding was perfect in its kind, capable of apprehending all things clearly and judging concerning them according to truth, without any mixture of error. Indeed, Wesley goes on to say, probably the human spirit, like the angelical, then discovered truth by intuition. But humans have no innate ideas. At this point he was in full concert with the arguments of John Locke. All of human ideas come by way of experience, but this experience is at its best immediate and full. Various factors in this natural image of God humans share with animals. They too are possessed of self-moving spirits, of sense perception, and some measure of understanding. But in humans, beside the natural image, there is the moral image. And this is humans' initial perfection in love, justice, mercy, and truth. Not only are humans capable of apprehending God, in their original righteousness, they do apprehend God and orient their living toward God, but in this, humans are unique among earthly creatures. However, that status is precarious because humans are free. The natural image of God in humans includes the ability to make decisive choices. But there is no rigorous predestination, so Wesley bears down hard on this insight over against predestinarian Calvinism. He insists that humans are generally free, and he offers reasons primarily from his conception of the nature of God. Because God is just, there can be no thoroughgoing foreordination. Because God is truthful, we cannot be deceived in our senses that we are free. Because humans are morally responsible, it is necessary for humans to recognize that what humans decide will make a crucial difference both in what they do and in what comes afterward. The capacity for genuine and crucial decision is, of course, the source of human downfall. For when humans choose in disobedience to God, then their initial perfection is lost. This means, first of all, the loss of the moral image of God. The original righteousness of humans is taken away. Instead of being oriented in love toward God, humans become oriented instead toward the satisfactions to be had from creatures. Moreover, humans lose in part the natural image of God. Particularly, they lose the capacity of intuitive apprehension, whether of God or of the world about them. So human moral failure results also in a mental disabling, which can be called properly enough depravity. Wesley is about as emphatic in assertion of the reality of original sin as he is in his assertions of genuine human freedom. Original sin constitutes a pervasive and inescapable groundswell. Wesley will not use the word sin save for conscious transgression. But conscious transgression rises perpetually out of the inherited massive tendency, and this tendency constitutes the depravity of the fallen human. Even so, despite the fallen state of humans, there is not a total reduction to the level of the animalistic. Humans retain conscience, and conscience which perpetually apprises them of their faults is, in Wesley's thought, a remnant of divine grace. Wesley calls this preventing or prevenient grace, and it is present to all humans even after the fall. There is no such thing as a merely natural human in the sense of one who is a member of the natural order and devoid of membership in the moral order. So long as humans are human at all, there remain in them the spark of what Wesley calls empowering grace. It prompts humans to recognize their faults, but is also the basis upon which they can turn away from their faults if they so choose. What Wesley's trying to say is to maintain a position that will avoid rigid determinism requires that at the same time we avoid the suggestion that humans can save themselves without God's help. The grace of God is indispensable. Grace is present in the first instance. It is the continuing ability of humans to distinguish between good and evil, and as long as the power remains within them, the grace of God is still at work in humans. Moreover, if humans act in accordance with that inner guidance, they may expect more help with God. Notice here the overtones that resonate with Trent and with Erasmus. It will be as if that humans are lifting themselves out of their depraved state. It will be as if what humans do to respond to the grace of God can work on them now, and that more grace will come. And with increasing divine help, they may expect to be saved. Now, this preventing grace is not itself justifying grace. Human salvation is not to be found simply in our ability to recognize that we are depraved. This is just an indispensable starting point. If there were not this point of contact, there would be no sufficient basis for salvation. Salvation comes in the guise of new birth, but there must be a fundamental change in humans' total outlook and tendency to action, and that deserves to be called nothing less than regeneration. Regeneration comes about not through human effort, but through God's favor, through faith in God as revealed in Christ. This is a point where Wesley found it necessary to turn away from the mystical understanding of Christianity, from the philosophy which for a time attracted him. William Law, from those early writings he had learned, did not have the figure of Christ at the center. He talked about the love of God, the renewal of humans, but he did not recognize that such renewal and such love are crucially found in the person of the Redeemer, apprehended as our personal Savior. Faith in God through Jesus Christ is therefore in the first instance an intuitive apprehension that God is a God of love. Insofar as it has a cognitive aspect, this cognition of the love of God in Jesus will be ineffective save as it issues in a practical, volitional response, as the way of commitment to the favor of that God. So faith is at once intuition or assensus and voluntary fiducia. Notice here that what Wesley does is to join the two great traditions of the pre-Lutheran church, assensus, the whole giving of one's mind, and the sense of trust, the voluntary, fiducia, as acknowledgement of the truth of the Christian gospel, and so builds a new way of seeing what human faithfulness is. Faith without love is just not faith, to Wesley. Now, justification is understood in terms, accordingly, of forgiveness. But more than forgiveness, it has something to do with the nature of infused grace. Remember that our starting point was preventing grace, so that it becomes possible to respond to God by recognizing the distinction between right and wrong. And so to respond more and more adequately to God's continuing presence means that justification be regarded as a turning point, whereas sanctification must be regarded as growth and gradual assimilation of grace and renewal of life. The end toward which such a process moves is the restoration of the divine image in humans. What humans lost through the will, they can regain only through God's favor, but only as they accept more and more as God's the power which enabled them to make a fresh start. To grow in grace requires that humans perform good works, but the good works are grounded in the gift of grace, not in anything that we ourselves do. Sanctification is then fundamentally a grant of power from God, which makes possible self-activity within humans. Doubtless we come then to the question of Christian perfection. Many times this question has come up in the course of Wesley's own thinking. He even wrote a book about it. It is one of the hallmarks of those who follow in his footsteps. Yet it is very difficult to say most often exactly what Wesley had in mind. Let me here try to give my own accounting. In 1777, toward the close of his life, Wesley revised once more his book, A Plain Account of Christian Perfection, following through the development of the teachings of the subject from 1725, when he took his B.A. degree. He defines Christian perfection in this statement as simplicity of intention and purity of affection. The direction of one's life must be unambiguously toward God, and one's love for God must not be tainted by preference for oneself. Christian perfection is not of achievement, but of intent and disposition. So Wesley teaches that Christians are saved in this world from all sin, from all unrighteousness, that they are now in some sense perfect, as not to commit sin and to be freed from evil thoughts and evil tempers. This is another more perilous way of saying the same thing that he says at the end of his sermon on Christian perfection in 1740. His thought, I think, is clearly in line with the Augustinian tradition, that the believer is freed from the imputation of sin to him, even though the tinder of sin remains, and even though humans fell in numerous misdeeds. The right direction of one's life remains fundamental. So right direction can be achieved unambiguously. In the preface to the second hymnal, which he and his brother Charles put out in 1741, the doctrine is enthusiastically overstated, suggesting that it is in this life that Christians attain the degree of blessedness which is traditionally reserved for the world to come. This enthusiasm, this rhapsody, struck Wesley as too strong. This is far too strong, he said. See my sermon on wandering thoughts. And now the crucial point. For a time it may be so, but not always. For a time it may be so, but not always. Sometimes they do not, at other times they do, and that grievously. Thus Wesley cautions us against taking too literally things said in an excess of zeal. So what the doctrine means essentially is that we are to have that mind which was also in Christ Jesus. In other words, to be inwardly and outwardly devoted to God, all devoted in heart and life. Sinless perfection is a phrase I never use lest I should seem to contradict myself, wrote Wesley. Involuntary transgressions are not overcome in this life. One can achieve freedom from deliberate and willful wrongdoing. That is involved in having the right basic disposition, but one cannot achieve such total control of oneself as to avoid all wrongdoing. Christian perfection, therefore, is a glimpse. There are moments in which it is obtained, and it is more likely to be attained toward the end of one's Christian career, but as glimpses, not as a permanent state of being. This seems to me to be something close to a Catholic understanding of the duty of humans, and Wesley identifies with this. He thinks it's right to declare that humans are not helpless in God's hands. The humans continue to be responsible and free after they've received the grace of justification. From the beginning to the end of our lives, we are responsible moral agents, upon whom the need continually rests to make right choices in every moment of our lives. The church is the company of believers, among whom the word is rightly preached and the sacraments are rightly administered. That's good traditional Protestant doctrine that Wesley affirmed. And it seems to me to have always been his intent, if not his practice, to help establish within the church smaller groups of persons committed to a more radical and disciplined life than that professed and practiced by the church at large. Now, this particular way of looking at things meant that Wesley, although never ever stopping being Anglican, was always on the outskirts of Anglicanism, because he stood at odds with many of their church practices, not least of which in his insistence that the more committed and disciplined life entailed more committed and disciplined attention to neighbor and to love of neighbor, particularly those less fortunate. So Wesley identified with and was often to be found in the company of persons who had been shunned by society. The societies that he encouraged, which were also separate, were companies of especially devoted people. So he wasn't trying to break away from the church as much as to revitalize it from within. Indeed, Wesley opposed willful separation, and he used pretty strong language about it at times, likening it to murder, because it involves the destruction of the life of a Christian community. Wesley is ambiguous about his views about government. Presbyterian polity appears appropriate, but the apostolic succession of bishops in the Church of England is a principle which he accepted without question. So there is a great deal of ambiguity in Wesley's view about how the church is to be governed, But there was no ambiguity in his view that a freshly vitalized understanding of the Christian faith and of Christian life is something that everybody should not only profess, but should pursue.